Hi there, my name is Greg Engert. I'm the beer director for the Neighborhood Restaurant Group. A collection of beer specialist bars and restaurants in Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, North Bethesda, Maryland, and New York City. Today we are at Shelter, our soon-to-be beer bar in D.C. It's a really cool beer bar that's going to focus on some lower ABV, sessionable beers, but it's going to also showcase beer in the best way possible. And that's what we've been dedicated to doing since we got started about 15 years ago. I always like to say that craft beer does not a craft beer bar make, because frankly, one of the easiest parts of our jobs is getting our hands on the rare stuff. The high-octane barrel-aged kegs, the hazy double IPA 16-ounce 4-packs. While that definitely takes a lot of effort, research, relationship building, and curation, that's really just the tip of the iceberg for what it takes to showcase craft beer the way that we want to do it. Getting the beer is one thing, but making sure that it tastes perfect every single day is far more difficult. Making sure that your staff is trained to be able to build experiences around each of the beers takes a ton of effort. It takes a lot of passion day in and day out to make sure that the glassware is clean, that the specific glass is chosen, that we pair the beer to specific foods from our kitchen, and overarchingly just add layers of knowledge, enjoyment, and experience to the consumption of that craft beer. Ever since we got started about 15 years ago, we've been hard at work trying to figure out ways to really differentiate the craft beer experience that we can offer from that which you'd have at other bars and restaurants or at your home. It's become even more important to do that because so much beer is now available. When we got started, it was hard to find craft beer. Your local liquor store did not carry it. Your corner bar did not dispense it. And so if you wanted to get craft beer, you'd have to go to specialist retailers and specialist bars. Well, now it's everywhere, which was always our dream, but it makes it that much more difficult to get someone to come to your bar or your restaurant or your tap room to drink craft beer when they can just grab it and drink it at home or have it at every bar up and down the street. So it's really important to work out the ways that you can differentiate your product and your experience. And we've come up with quite a few ways to do that, and that's what we're going to be talking about during this course. About 15 years ago, the craft beer game was far different than it is today. Getting your hands on the good stuff took a lot of distributor cajoling. You had to contact breweries directly and basically beg them to send you a little bit of beer to showcase at your bar, your restaurant, or your retail shop. And that's because really, 15, 20 years ago, craft beer wasn't the booming, profitable business that it is today. And so everybody who was involved back then was doing it pretty much out of pure passion. What it also meant was that the general public was not really all that interested in craft beer, and that was our job. We wanted to proselytize. We wanted to get out there and convince people that they should be spending their hard-earned money and their hard-earned calories on the good stuff, on great craft beer that's been handcrafted by passionate producers all over the world. To do that, though, took a lot of education. And one of the things that we were very concerned with was to make craft beer accessible from the start. We knew that if we went the way of wine, of specialized knowledge, it was going to be difficult to get as many people as we wanted to get turned on to craft beer. So when I started to think about the way to showcase craft beer on menus and to communicate the different flavor nuances of each of the beers that we were showcasing, I quickly realized that geographic origin wasn't going to be the best way to do that. First off, when I say the word Belgian beer, we may have an idea of what we think that is, but Belgian beer can be so many different things. You have hoppy, dry Belgian beer, you have Belgian lagers, you have sour Belgian beers, fruited Belgian beers, low ABV, high ABV. Just categorizing by country didn't work. And especially when we started looking at the American craft beer scene, we had American, and still do have great American breweries that make authentic Belgian-style beers. So we knew that it wasn't going to be about geography, and started to think it shouldn't be about style either, because style is something that you need to know to understand. So if I give you a menu where everything is organized by style, that demands that you understand the style to really get into the beers that we're showcasing. So instead of that, we wanted to make it super simple and easy for people to dive right in and start to taste through all of the different options that we had. And so we decided to go with flavor profiles. So I created a flavor profile system whereby all the different craft beers we have our hands on could be broadly categorized into 7 major flavor categories: crisp, hop, malt, roast, fruit and spice, smoke, and tart and funky. All of these beers are certainly complex, right? It's not to say that if you're a crisp beer, you couldn't also be kind of hoppy, or if you're fruity and spicy, you couldn't also be malty. So we instilled some sub-flavor categories to make that kind of known, right? So you can have a crisp beer that is delicately fruity, like a Kolsch or a cream ale. You can have a crisp beer that is malt accented, like a Helles or a Vienna lager. And then you can have a subtly hoppy crisp beer that is dry, bitter, and even aromatically hoppy, like a classic German or Czech Pilsner. By doing this, we were recognizing all of the different complexities, but also making it quite easy for the guests to kind of get into what they would like, or to know what to stay away from. And that's the other big thing, is that when we're categorizing beers, sometimes it comes down to what's the overarching character of the beer? What's that one flavor profile that people might not like? And that's the category it goes in, because as much as the category system is there to get you to choose the beer that you're gonna love, it's also there to keep you away from a beer that you might not like. So the most obvious example is when guests would come in and say, I absolutely hate bitterness. We knew to keep them away from the hop section. If a wine drinker came in and said, I don't really love beer, we'd point them towards the tart and funky section, knowing that we had some wine-like offerings there that might be a cool bridge to get them into craft beer. The first category is the crisp category, and this is the category for the cleanest, lightest, most refreshing and quaffable styles of beer out there. Primarily these are lagers, although there are a number of ales here as well. But the idea here is that these are beers that are fun to drink. They're as much about texture and taste as they are about aroma. They're served in larger vessels because we drink these, we don't sip them. And we tend to serve these at cooler temps because we want to maximize the kind of crisp, refreshing effervescence that comes from serving beers at colder temps. So within this category, there are 3 major themes. The first is the delicate fruit theme. So I mentioned just now that there are some ales that we define as crisp. These are beers that are fermented with ale yeast, so you'd expect them to show kind of fruity, spicy phenols and some fruity esters, like Belgian beers or even some English-style ales. These ales tend to be fermented colder. They tend to sometimes be lagered, and so we get to temper the fruity, spicy aspect. It's still there, but it's not as impactful as it would be for a beer we would put in, say, the fruit and spice category. And so in the delicate fruit subcategory of crisp, you're gonna find beers like Kolsch, the classic German ale fermented cold to be crisp and refreshing, kind of the ale answer to lager. You're also gonna have English-style summer ales or golden ales. Those are also fermented a bit colder. You'll have cream ales in this category, or American wheat ale as well. All beers that are going to showcase just a little bit of fruit, but still more of a kind of grainy malt sweetness, crisp, clean, refreshing, not too bitter, not too full-bodied, really kind of the lightest styles around. The second subcategory is the malt accented category. These are crisp, refreshing lagers that focus more on malt than they do on hop. So this is where you're going to find the classic Helles lagers of Munich, other pale lagers that showcase more of that lightly toasted biscuity quality rather than a lot of hop bitterness. You're going to see Vienna and amber lagers that are going to have more toasted sweetness and richness on the palate. These are reddish in hue. Oktoberfest and Märzens are also in this category as even richer, bolder versions. But the thing is that just because it's a malty lager doesn't mean that it's a crisp beer. When you get bigger and richer and stronger, like Bock beers or Dunkels, those tend to have so much malt character, we're less inclined to define them as crisp beers because overarchingly the malt flavor profile is what's most impactful. When we're talking about crisp beers, the last subcategory is subtle hoppiness. There are some classic styles of lagers, Pilsner being the most well-known, that go here. So these are beers that are borderline hoppy, but we don't quite put them in the hop category because the hop character is restrained enough that the crisp, refreshing nature of the beer is what stands out most. So whether it's a German-style Pils that tends to be on the dry side, or a Czech Pils that has a little bit more malt character, or even a dry-hopped Italian Pils, you're going to find them in this category. Of course, American brewers taken some of these lagers to a different level and creating things like India Pale Lager, where they'll take a sort of Pilsner-like recipe and hit it with American hops. Those still are crisp, they're refreshing and clean, so they go into this category. The next category we're going to talk about is the hop category. This is a fun and incredibly important category that has evolved over time. So hoppy beers are simply those where the hop, which is the female flowering cone of the hop vine, takes precedence over all of the other aspects of the beer. These are beers that are going to showcase some bitterness for the most part nowadays. They're also going to show flavors from essential hop oils used to create the beers themselves. The first subcategory goes back to the beginnings of hop-driven beers. These are earthy and dry hoppy beers. So this is where you find kind of classic English styles that are so hopped up that we bring them out of the malt category and put them into the hop category. This is ordinary bitter. This is English pale ale. Also, when you get beers like Belgian IPAs, this sends them into the earthy and dry category, or even the Brut IPA. All these beers have nice hop bitterness, they're bone dry, and rather than having like big tropical fruit or citrus aromatics from their hops, they tend to be a little bit earthier. They tend to be spicy and floral, maybe with a little bit of lemony citrus, maybe with some tea-like qualities, particularly for the English styles. But I would categorize these as kind of like old school hoppy beers. The next subcategory is malty backbone. At this point, these are also kind of old school hoppy beers. California Common comes to mind, an amberish hop-forward lager that's fermented like an ale, Anchor Steam being the most notable example, of course, but also hoppy red ales and American barley wines like Sierra Nevada Bigfoot. There was a time when these kinds of styles were really big, more balance here. So you've got the Pacific Northwest hop character of American brewing, the grapefruit, the resin, the pine, but rather than a golden, dry body, you have more of a rich, reddish caramelized sweetness to balance against the hop intensity. When it comes to the third category, we have beers that were, until relatively recently, the most popular American styles. And these are the kind of classic West Coast pale ales and IPAs and session IPAs and fresh hop beers. And then we put this under the bold, herbal, and citric subcategory. So these are beers like Blind Pig from Russian River, or Stone IPA, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, beers that are bone dry. They utilize Pacific Northwest hops that are going to give you a big kind of piney, resinous quality, some grapefruit, some citrus, some tangerine, but a lot of bitterness. And these are the beers that dominated for a long time. So whether you're talking about pale ale or getting those even bigger to IPA or even up to double and triple IPAs, all of these beers are going to showcase bold hop character both aromatically, but also on the palate with big bitterness. Over the past few years, we had to add a brand new subcategory to the hop group, and that is soft and juicy because, of course, American brewers have been on a slow path that's gotten exponentially faster recently to redefine what it means to create and drink hoppy beers in the US and now globally. So whereas those bold herbal and citric IPAs and pale ales would add quite a few Pacific Northwest hops to the boil and use relatively clean yeast that didn't throw a lot of esters and that would drop bright, they would utilize grain recipes that were mostly barley, and they would ferment these things all the way down dry. Sometimes they would be golden straw in color, sometimes they'd be dark gold to amber, but they would be hoppy and bitter, very straightforward and delicious. Well, over time, brewers started to pull the crystal malt out of these beers and utilize lighter malts. And instead of just using barley, they'd add wheat and oats, which would bring more haze to the beer, from proteins, also more residual sweetness, starch richness on the palate. They stopped heavily hopping only in the boil. Instead, they would move a lot of that hopping into the whirlpool or even mostly into dry hop after fermentation to really maximize the aromatics and to downplay the bitterness on the palate. And then instead of using relatively neutral ale yeasts, they started using English ale yeasts that would give you more of a fruity ester. These would be yeast that wouldn't flocculate as well so that they sit in solution. And now when you went to smell one of these beers, you wouldn't smell dank, piney, sometimes garlicky aromas, raw fruit aromas. Now you'd smell really straight ahead, bright fruit aromas. Almost all of that herbal character would be pulled away. On the palate, you had more malt richness, you had more sweetness, way less bitterness, and a fuller, rounder drinking experience as well. The malt category is an amazing category of beer, and once upon a time, this is a category that was supremely popular. Not as much nowadays, but these are incredibly complex beers that run a wide range of flavors and also give us really great food pairing opportunities tableside. So when I talk about malty beers, these are beers where they're not as crisp and refreshing as your Pilsners and your Kolsch. They have much more richness on the palate. They're not going to be nearly as hoppy as the hop-driven beers. And even when they're fermented with ale yeast, the fruity, spicy aspect is not so impactful as to push them into the fruit and spice category where you find a lot of Belgian-style beers. These are beers where the malt notes come through more than anything. And when we talk about malt notes, we're talking about bready, nutty, toffee, toasty, caramelized sweetness and richness on the palate. I like to break these down into two different subcategories. First is toasty and nutty. And this is where there's basically not a lot of yeast character coming through. This is all about the malts that are used to make the beers. So you have beers like English Milds and English Brown Ales that have a lot of really rich malt flavor, a lot of dark bread, crusty notes coming through, some raisin, maybe a hint of fruit, but nothing overwhelming. And then all of your malty lagers are going to be here. So whether it's a Bock lager or Doppelbock from Germany, or a Tamavi dark lager from Czech Republic, or a Dunkel from Bavaria, they're all going to be listed in this category. You're going to expect flavors of raisin and fig and Tootsie Rolls, Coca-Cola. They tend to be a little bit on the crisp side, but again, the malt richness is there, so it doesn't go into the crisp category. The other subcategory of malty beers is fruit and toffee. So these tend to be malt-driven beers that do utilize ale yeast fermentations and do throw a bit of fruity aromatics, things like orange marmalade and plum and maybe red delicious apples. We're going to find a lot of British-style beers here, and even some malt-driven American-style beers. Like this is the Antique Amber from Three Sons. The hop character is restrained here, and just enough fruit quality to come through to put it into this category. But you're also going to see almost forgotten styles like Irish red ales, French bière de garde is in this category, English barley wine, Scotch ales, and wee heavies. So whether they're lower in ABV or higher in ABV, you're going to have lots of malt richness and some really interesting fruit notes coming through. The roast category is next, and this is another constantly evolving category. It used to be that we would divide these into those kinds of beers that are softer and silkier on the palate and those that are a little bit darker and drier. But with some of the evolutions in craft brewing over the past few years, we've added a whole new category called rich and decadent. First and foremost, all of the beers in this category are going to be darker in color. They're using roasted malt and oftentimes just roasted barley to generate darker colors and darker flavors. You're going to expect flavors of cocoa and coffee, chocolate, different types, whether it's latte or espresso, whether it's milk chocolate or dark chocolate. All this is going to come in with the different kinds of roasted dark malts employed. For those beers that tend to use more roasted malt and not a lot of just roasted barley, they tend to be a little bit less roasty and bitter on the palate. Oftentimes they'll even employ lactose milk sugar, which goes unfermented by yeast to give it a little bit of a sweeter edge, or a lot of oats that bring a lot of silkiness in. So this is the soft and silky category. And this is where you're going to find not just sweet stouts or milk stouts and oatmeal stouts, but also Schwarzbiers, German black lagers that are lightly roasty, not too intense. You're going to find brown porters from England here that are rich and roasty, but also quite malty, and so tend to be a little softer on the palate. Baltic porters, which are often fermented cold like lagers and very drinkable, are also going to be in this category. And then we have the things that are more classically roasty. These are the dark and dry stouts like Guinness, but also American-style black IPAs, American brown ales that tend to be so well hopped that they develop a bitterness that makes the beer taste even roastier than it would be without quite a huge hopping rate. Imperial stouts are also going to be in this category. These are richer beers that are filled with espresso and dark chocolate flavors. They can be big and strong, or they can be light and refreshing, but they're always going to have a good bit of dryness on the palate. The last roast subcategory is one that we just added recently, and this is the rich and decadent subcategory. So a lot of American brewers took some of the softer and silkier qualities of classic milk stouts and oatmeal stouts and pushed the envelope to make them even softer, richer, sweeter on the palate. These are the pastry or dessert stouts. Oftentimes they are hit with adjuncts like peanut butter or coconut, lots and lots of vanilla, chocolate sauce, you name it. They end up being really cool culinary beers that go just as well with dessert as they often do with savory foods. The smoke category of craft beer is the oldest, probably, and possibly the least popular that we have today. We love smoked beers, and we always keep at least a few on each of our menus. But these are beers that harken back to an older time. So to make beer, you have to malt grain. If you just try to ferment raw grain, nothing is going to happen. So in order to malt, you need to steep grain in water and then heat it with some kind of heat source. Up until about a few hundred years ago, that would have happened over direct fire. And so if you happen to be landlocked in northern Bavaria, in and around the area of Bamberg and Franconia, you needed to use a certain kind of kindling to heat your home and to cook your food and to malt your grain and to boil your wort in the brewing process. And so you would use whatever was around that wasn't needed for other things, and that was beechwood, because beechwood is a very brittle wood that's good for just about nothing except for burning. And luckily for the Franconians, when you burn beechwood, you create this incredible savory, kind of meaty, smoky flavor. And when you direct fire grain over this kind of wood, you end up with grain that's going to impart this delicious kind of ham-like, campfire-y flavor to the beer that results. And so that's why we have Rauch beer, most notably from Schlenkerla, but also Spezial and some others in the Franconia region, Bavaria. Over time, as kilning methods became more advanced, there was less and less just direct kilning where you don't get as much control or as much fermentable sugar. And so the smoke flavors one by one kind of got taken out of beer. So it's not as many around to find these days. There are many different kinds of smoked beers out there. I mentioned the Franconian and Rauch beers that utilize beechwood, but if you were a brewer in the British Isles or in Scandinavia, you wouldn't be using beechwood to light fires, you'd be using peat. And when you light peat up to dry your grain during the malting process, you invest the grain with the flavors of peat. And then you're gonna make peat smoked beer, and once distillation gets figured out and finds its way north to, say, Scotland, they start distilling their peat smoked beer, and boom, you have the wonderful kind of single malt scotches that we have today. Smoked beer is amazing, and there are still brewers experimenting with it. So it's not just beechwood or peat smoked malts. Sometimes you'll have oak smoked malts, hickory smoked malts, you name it. Sometimes brewers are even smoking fruit and then adding it in. So there's a lot of really cool stuff. And even more recently, there's been great scholarship to pull out some traditional styles of smoked beer that had kind of gone by the wayside, like Grodziskie Gratzer or Lichtenheiner, oftentimes bringing in different adjuncts like wheat or even acidity to give us a kind of smoky sour beer from the past. The fruit and spice category of beer is phenomenal. These are beers where a lot of the overarching flavors are coming from fermentation. So these are ale, yeast-driven beers with ale fermentations that are going to throw lots of fruity esters and phenolic spices. What's really cool about this category is that it breaks down by color. So you have the bright fruit and spice beers, and then you have the dark fruit and spice beers. And when you talk about the bright fruit and spice beers, these are things like Belgian-style wit beer, Bavarian Hefeweizen, Saison, Triple, Belgian strong golden ale or Belgian blonde ales, even Helles Weizenbachs. And all of these are going to have brighter fruity flavors based on the malts that are employed. So you can expect things like banana, peach, pear, maybe apricot. On the flip side, you have the dark fruit and spice beers, and these are styles that utilize darker malts, bringing their flavors darker and earthier. These are things like Dunkelweizen, Belgian-style doubles, Abt Grand Crus that are often called quadruples, or even Dunkles Weizenbachs, Aventinus probably being the most popular example of the style. And so when you drink these beers, you're still going to get that fruity, spicy flavor, but it's not going to be as much banana, peach, apricot, and pear. It's going to be more raisin, fig, plum, maybe cherry and raspberry. All of these beers tend to have some nicely developed malt flavors. The brights are going to be, slightly toasty, biscuity. The darker ones are going to have more of that fig Newton quality. The hop character is mild. Some saisons will get hoppier, and some Belgian-style, dry Belgian-style beers are definitely going to be hoppy. For the most part, these are balanced beers with really big, fruity, spicy aromatics. The last category is tart and funky, and these are amazing, fun beers that have become some of the most popular ones for us to showcase and specifically to pair with food. They run the gamut from delicate tart and funky beers that are really light, tart, refreshing, to those that are kind of earthy based on the use of Brettanomyces, to those that are really, really fruity, sometimes more fruit than beer, and then all the way to ones that are vinous. These are fruit-driven tart and funky beers that are wine-like and super complex. Tart and funky beers utilize mixed fermentations. So if they're tart or even sour, they're going to be utilizing different kinds of bacteria. Lactobacillus, Pediococcus being the two most prevalent. And then if they're going to be funky and earthy, they're going to be using Brettanomyces, different kinds of strains of Brettanomyces that are going to give you the kind of horse blanket, barnyard, leather, sometimes pie cherry, citrus, overripe pineapple qualities as well. The delicate tart and funky beers are those that are really clean and bright and vibrant. These are like modern Berliner Weisse without fruit or Goza, but also mixed fermentation beers that are only slightly funky if Brettanomyces is involved. The earthy subcategory of tart and funky beers really rely on Brettanomyces. Some of these beers aren't even sour because they don't use any bacteria. I'm thinking of Brett IPAs and certain kinds of Brett Pale Ales. But the others are both tart and funky in this category. Those are things like Lambic or Gueuze, the blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old spontaneously fermented oak barrel-aged beers. When you drink these beers, you're going to expect maybe a bit of acidity, but a lot of that kind of really complex, earthy, grassy, hay-like, sometimes barnyardy flavors. You should see some really cool fruit aromatics as well. The last two subcategories concentrate on fruit because we get tartness in beer not just from different bacterial fermentations, but also from the use of different kinds of fruits. Fruits can bring tartaric and malic acid to join in with the lactic acid we may get from different bacteria. But nowadays, there's different kinds of fruit-driven sour beers out there. In the old days, we saw more barrel-aged mixed fermentation beers that would then be further steeped on whole fruit. I'm thinking, of course, of traditional Belgian lambics, Kriek, Framboise, things like that. And American brewers certainly jumped on that bandwagon to make their own version of mixed fermentation beers that are barrel-aged and then aged on fruit, sometimes even venturing into spontaneous fermentation territory. While complex, often barrel-aged fruited sour beers have been popular recently, I'm thinking of classic traditional fruited lambics and mixed fermentation beers from the States. Sweeter, non-traditional fruit lambics have also been popular for some time. And these beers, interestingly, have kind of been revived with a whole new cadre of American brewer making quick fruited sour beers. So back in the old days, 15, 20 years ago, it was really, really hard for us to get people to drink traditional lambics. Oftentimes they found that they were too sour, too funky, too oaky. I like to talk about early on in my career, it was nearly impossible to give Cantillon away. Back then, when people heard the word lambic, all they wanted was Framboise, typically from Lindemans. And these were beers that were not oaky, not funky. They tended to be extremely fruity, really, really low in alcohol, and juicy. People loved them. And so there was a time where that type of beer tended to go away and people were really interested in the traditional stuff. But even now, as traditional lambic and traditional fruited mixed fermentation beers remain popular, that thirst for the kind of simple, straight ahead, juicy, fruit-driven beer that used to be represented by Lindeman's Framboise has come back. And now you see all manner of 16-ounce 4-pack cans of fruited sour beers that are absolutely delicious, amazing with food, super refreshing, dominating this category. When I first was getting into craft beer, I was inspired as much by the incredible beers I was discovering as I was by wine. Because it seemed to me that with each new beer I tasted, particularly from classic brewing traditions of Europe, that while the flavors were remarkable, the narratives were spectacular, the same kind of service afforded to wine, for some reason, had not been extended to beer. And so I found that there was really a lot needed to be done to make sure that the brewer's art was extended to the guest. So often brewers would pour all of this time, sweat, energy, and passion into crafting the beers, only for it to show up at the bar, the restaurant, or the retail shop and languish on the shelves in direct sunlight, or to be served directly from the bottle or can rather than in the proper glass, or to be served way too cold. So seeing all that, I made it my professional mission to extend the brewer's care and passion beyond the brew house and all the way to the guest, to make sure that all those remarkable flavors imbued into the beer would be experienced fully by the guest. One of the most impactful things for beer service is temperature. And it's been one of my biggest regrets for the ubiquity of craft beer is that as it has gotten more popular and as it's more and more available at bars and tap rooms and restaurants and bottle shops, it's not always served in the perfect way. A lot of times these bars and restaurants and bottle shops are just happy to get their hands on these beers and they just kind of want to sell them to the guest. The beers don't get to be experienced in the way that they should be. Far too often when I go to a bar or restaurant or even a tap room, I'm served a beer that is way too cold. So cold that my palate gets numbed, and when I go to experience the beer, I barely can smell anything. And this is an unfortunate result of the fact that American beer for so long was dominated by industrial lager with very little flavor. These crisp, refreshing, fizzy, yellow conveyors of mild intoxication need to be served ice cold, and they certainly needed to be served ice cold. And so when draft beer came around in the 1960s, we were dispensing not West Coast IPAs and Belgian-style sour beers, we were dispensing industrial lager. And so the temperature for those draft systems was a really cool 37 degrees. That is the best temp at which to taste and experience a light industrial lager. Unfortunately, when American craft brewers said, we don't want to make those anymore, and we certainly don't want to drink them, we want to brew the things that we tasted overseas, the stuff that we've been brewing in our basements and in our garages and sharing with our friends, and then they put these beers into kegs or even into bottles and shipped them out to bars and restaurants and retail outlets. Unfortunately, those beers ended up getting served the way that industrial lager had been served for so many years. Way too cold, often in straight-sided shaker pint glasses, many of which were not perfectly clean. And sometimes they weren't even served in glass at all. They would just be handed to the guest to be chugged out of the can or the bottle. Wasn't a lot of training going on with the staff, wasn't a lot of food pairing ideas added to the beers when they were being served at all. So when we set about correcting the issues of draft, bottle, can service, and how everything had been served too cold, we devised a draft system that would keep beers at the appropriate temperatures. And when I started to study wine and think about the way that wines have been dispensed, I learned a lot. And I started to think about all the different kinds of beer flavors out there, all the different styles, the different flavor categories, the different weights on the palate, the different textures. It seemed to me that there were three perfect temperatures at which to serve all beers. We then set about adjusting each of our bottle and can coolers to be at one of 3 temperatures, and even devising draft systems that, based on different draft lines, could serve beers at different temps. So rather than serving everything at 37 degrees now, we would serve beers at either 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 48 degrees Fahrenheit, or 54 degrees Fahrenheit. When you think about which temp is appropriate for each beer that you're serving, you have to consider the weight of the beer and the style of the beer. Beers that are crisper, dry, lighter on the palate, lower ABV beers, these are typically your crisp beers, your pilsners, your lagers, your kolsch. These are all beers that benefit from being served a little bit colder than others. And that's because coldness accentuates bitterness, and it accentuates carbonation and even acidity. So when you're thinking about pilsners and lagers and kolsch, a large part of enjoyment for those styles of beers come from the textural experience of drinking them. So to serve a pilsner or a lager at 42 degrees Fahrenheit means that it remains cold enough to stay vibrantly carbonated on your palate, to give you that beautiful, refreshing quality. If you're talking about pilsner, it's going to maintain the bitterness that you need from that pils to keep it brisk and snappy on your palate. When we talk about flavor, we're really talking about 3 different things. The first and the simplest is taste. This is what your palate experiences as you eat a dish or drink a beer. These are very basic experiences: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, but also things like heat, spicy heat, fatty qualities, or even umami, that kind of 7th flavor out there that is best encapsulated in things like fish sauce and dashi and tomatoes and mushrooms, a kind of meaty flavor. When it comes to the more complex elements of flavor, now we're talking about aroma, or the olfactory senses, is where we parse the different nuances of flavor. That's where you smell the particular fruits and spices of a Belgian-style beer. That's where you can experience a different hop flavor, whether it's the spicy floral Saaz or the very citric and leafy green, kind of lemony quality of Cascade hops. That all comes through the nose. The last part of flavor is texture. That's weight. Is it rich on the palate? Is it light? Is it heavily carbonated? Is it mildly carbonated? All 3, texture, taste, and aroma, come together to give you the broad flavor experience we enjoy when consuming craft beer. And it's our job to make sure that all 3, texture, taste, and aroma, come through as the brewer intended when we're serving you craft beer. So when it comes to beer, we pour like this. We're going to go in and we're going to smell the beer. Get right in there and parse the different aromatics that we find. 97% or more of flavor comes through the olfactory senses. So beer is made up of organic and chemical compounds. Organic compounds are that which are poured into the beer to make the beer. The malt, the hops, the water can bring organic compounds, the yeast. And then chemical compounds come from the interaction of all those organic compounds as well as from fermentation. So now you have a substance, beer, that is imbued with so many organic and chemical flavor compounds. To serve these beers too cold would mean that you would never get to experience all of these compounds. Like I said before, you serve a beer too cold, you numb your palate. Now you can't taste anything. But also if you serve it too cold, you can't smell anything. It's similar to cooking at your house, right? You might have some leftover pizza in the fridge. You might like eating cold pizza. But when you taste cold pizza, you don't taste anything. Now, when you take that cold pizza and you put it into your oven, after a few minutes, your entire kitchen smells like pizza. And that's because heat and evaporation releases the organic and chemical, aromatic, volatile compounds within that dish, that food, but also within the beer. So in order to smell beers, to smell the compounds of the beers, you need a certain degree of heat. And that's why even for the lightest, most refreshing styles of beer, to serve them at 37 degrees means that you just can't smell anything. At 42 degrees, and a really crisp, refreshing Pilsner, you can parse the flavors of the hop in the nose. You can smell the different malt characteristics. But at 42 degrees, you still maintain taste and texture, because at that temperature, you're still going to maintain the carbonation. It's still going to be refreshing and crisp on the palate. Now, as beers become richer and stronger, they are imbued with more compounds. And they're also literally heavier. They have more molecular weight. So if we serve those beers, and now I'm not thinking about pilsners and lagers and such, I'm thinking about IPA, I'm thinking about porter, I'm thinking about brown ale, Belgian style, dark ales and triples and doubles. These are beers that are stronger and richer on the palate. If we serve them at 42 degrees, we don't give them enough heat to encourage the evaporation that's going to release enough of the aromatic compounds past the weight of the beer. So as beers become richer and heavier, you need to serve them warmer so that evaporation can be better achieved to get all those volatile aromas past the weight of the beer. Now you might be saying, well, if we serve a beer at 48 degrees, aren't we going to lose some of that crisp, refreshing quality? Aren't bitterness and acidity and carbonation going to be less intense at that temp? And that's absolutely right. But the bottom line is that IPAs are not supposed to be crushed the way that a Pilsner is. And so even if the bitterness of an IPA is slightly softer being served at 48 degrees, that's the proper trade-off to get more of the IPA's hop aromatics to jump through the glass. But even 48 degrees is not warm enough for the biggest and richest and most massive beers on the planet. When you talk about imperial stouts, when you talk about big British barley wines and Belgian Abt Grand Crus, these are beers that even served at 48 degrees are not going to release as much of the aroma as you need. They're just too rich and heavy. We need to serve these beers even warmer still at 54 degrees. At that temp, all of the aroma is going to jump out of the glass. You're going to get to investigate all of that aromatic intensity and complexity. At the same time, yes, you're going to have less intense carbonation, bitterness, and acidity, but that's okay, because these beers are really about aromatic investigation and about the rich malt flavors to wrap themselves around your palate. There's lots of different types of glassware out there, some more ornate than others, but the point here, the most important thing, is that beer must be served from a glass. I know some beers advise you to drink them straight from cans, but we really should, even if the beers are hazy, we should be able to take a look at them and appreciate and enjoy with our eyes as much as with our noses and our palates. The other thing is that so much of flavor comes through the nose. So if you just crack a beer and drink it out of the can, it's probably going to taste great and you're going to feel good, but you're not going to be able to experience all of the aromatic complexities that the beer is there to offer. So we need to use glass, but we shouldn't just use the same glass for everything. I love the history and nuance of glassware. I love how glassware allows us to kind of slow the game down, to enjoy the beer, to consider it, to take a look at it, to think about where did this glass come from, to remember that glassware in beer really didn't exist until about 150 years ago, until the Industrial Revolution made glassware available to the masses. And at that point, people dove into drinking bottles of beer and to drinking beers from glasses, and we've never looked back. So it's super important to drink beer from the glass and to consider the beer altogether, and of course at the right temp. So when I think about the crisp, clean, most refreshing styles of beers, the Pilsners, the lagers, the Weiss beers, the American wheats, the cream ales, the Kolsch, they should be served at the coldest temp, 42 degrees, not 37 degrees where you can't smell anything and barely taste a thing, but a little bit warmer to let those aromas jump out of the glass and still maintain the crisp, refreshing qualities built on bitterness, sometimes acidity and carbonation. When we're drinking these beers, we like to drink them out of narrow glasses like this, because these are beers that we drink. We're not sipping them, we're actually having a drink. And these are beers that with less surface area, we're not going to warm them up with our hands as much, right? So this is great. So these beers will remain cold over time, even as you drink them. Aromatic investigation is really important. So is head. And that's one other thing that's been great to see over time. Over the last 15 years, people have stopped sending their beer back because it's not filled all the way to the top. I think we've done a good job of explaining that head is super important to beer. Head retention, foam is your friend. And why is that? Well, because like I said earlier, beer has many, many, many aromatic and flavor compounds. Some of them are organic, some are chemical. They're all volatile. And with the right amount of heat and evaporation, they're going to jump out of the glass. But also, beer has head retention. It's got protein and residual starches that help maintain your head. You pour sparkling wine, you pour sparkling cider, it dissipates pretty quickly. Not so with beer. And that's great because foam acts as a kind of aromatic net. As CO2 tries to escape from the glass and comes to the top, it's dragging along with it all of these volatile aromatic compounds. And as it comes to the top and hits the head, it gets trapped in the net of the head, it stays there. And so when you get a beautiful glass of beer with that perfect head, it looks gorgeous. And then as you drink it and you start investigating it, you actually get even more flavor expression. As head subsides, more and more volatile aromatic compounds pop into the air and explode with aromatic intensity. So cherish foam, encourage it, and expect it. When I'm drinking or serving pilsners and lagers and wheat beers and Weiss beers, I love to do it out of these tall, narrow glasses. There's still enough area here for me to aromatically investigate, but these beers are not the most aromatically intense. You can get all you need from them at 42 degrees out of the glass without having to serve them in a big bowl or chalice or something like that. And in the meantime, you can keep the beer nice and cool because you're not getting it hot from your hand and really enjoy a full taste of the beer. These are beers that should be drank in larger volumes out of slender glasses and at cooler temps. As beers become richer on the palate, stronger, fuller bodied, I'm thinking now we're not serving pilsners and lagers as much or wheat beers. Now we're talking about IPA and porters or richer lagers, stouts, things like that. We're going to move them into the 48 degree category, heat them up a little bit so even more aromas can jump out of the glass. But then we're also going to serve them in different glasses. I like to say at this temp and with this next level of beer, the glass widens. Why is that? Well, these are beers that are still drinkable. Hazy IPA, Doppelbock, brown porter, robust porter, dry stout. These are beers you still are drinking, but they are richer, so they're served at warmer temps to get those aromas out, and they have a little bit more aromatic intensity. So you want to investigate that more. So we're still maintaining the drinkable aspect of these beers in these kinds of glasses, but we're widening it so that we can get in there and investigate the aroma a little bit more. Also, we want a wider rim so that the richer malt flavors we get from these kinds of beers can be delivered to our palates and wrap themselves around the palates. So if you're drinking classic British style beer, we do it in a Nordic pint like this, whether it's an English mild, robust porter, best bitter comes in this glass. You can drink them, they're typically low in ABV, but we can let that malt character kind of roundly attack the palate and really get it like that. Same thing for maltier lagers. So if I'm gonna do like a Märzen or a Vienna lager or even a smoked lager, I love to do it out of the Seidel or out of the Krug here. And of course, the old school version, for tradition's sake, is the Stein. So before the Industrial Revolution, people weren't drinking a lot of beer out of glass, of course. They were drinking it out of leather bags and stoneware and things like that. So looking at the beer wasn't as important. But also the way that the beers were made weren't really about the appearance as much as they were about the flavor. So you had a lot of murkier beers, a lot of heavily sedimented beers, and so they'd be right at home being served in a stone mug like this. You didn't really want to see the beer anyways. It would stay nice and cold and perfect. So even now, if you're traveling in certain parts of the world, you will see beers still dispensed in this kind of a mug. And so we love to pay homage to history and tradition by doing the same. This is a Becker. And this is my kind of favorite go-to glass, particularly for IPAs. And it's a glass I like to use instead of the shaker pint, that kind of classic stackable pint that doesn't give you a lot of nuance. And the reason I like this glass is because it's got some tapering to it. So when you pour beer in this glass, you get a really nice full head, and that little roundness at the top maintains the head. And remember I said, head is great, it's your friend, it's the net. And so when head sits up here, as it dissipates, it explodes with aromas for you to enjoy. You still can drink the beer nicely, you don't have to sip it, you don't have to necessarily swirl it, but the possibilities for aromatic investigation are there. As beers become richer and heavier on the palate, as they become stronger, they tend to have more and more volatile aromatic compounds that we want to get at when we're drinking the beer. For these beers, we tend to serve them warmer, 48 degrees, even all the way up to 54 degrees for the real big heavy hitters. And then we're going to put them in glasses that have stems. And we're going to put them in glasses that have curvature, that focus aromas, right? So each of these glasses, whether it's the tulip, the chalice, or the snifter, all function to help us really focus aromas and focus aromatic investigation. And when you're drinking from a glass like this, you're able to swirl, and swirling works like heating up to cause evaporation. You're energizing these aromatic compounds, you're encouraging them to get kind of left on the side of the glass where they have no choice but to jump into the air and become a part of the aromatic experience. So swirling is super important for these types of beers. These are beers like Belgian-style triples, saisons, blonder style beers I like to do in the tulip because they're still very drinkable. Once we take Belgian beers and make them richer and maltier and typically darker, once we get into Belgian style doubles and quadruples, we like to serve those in the chalice. We can still swirl them to get the aromatic investigation, but now we've got a wider rim, so we let those bigger, richer malt flavors spread out over our palate. When we get up to the biggest beers, the imperial stouts, the barley wines, I think there's no better glass than the snifter. Because the snifter lets us swirl, but it's got this beautiful tapering and focus so we can get in there and really see what's going on aromatically. It's the perfect glass for sipping. You could not chug this beer if you tried, nor should you. And this is the beer that we kind of think of as the universal example for the biggest, richest, strongest beers out there. So now we're going to talk about bottle and can service. It's really important to make sure that we don't distract with our service. We want to keep this all about the beer at the table. So when we approach the table, we want to make sure that we're keeping the bottle the way that it was stored, so that in the case of a saison, like Saison de Potre from Logis, any of the sediment that exists in the bottle remains at the bottom of the bottle. We do not want ever to dispense sediment from a beer like this into a guest's glass. There are a couple styles where that's okay, but for the most part, we want to keep the sediment behind. So when we approach the table, always showcase the bottle to the guest so they can take a look. And then we want to be really, really careful, especially with corked and cage versions, to not have an accident, but also keep this as quiet as possible. So I'm taking this like this, I'm making sure everything comes off as quiet as possible. We don't want some big pop table side. And then we always discard caps, cages, corks into our pockets. None of it leaving at the table or anything like that. So now the bottle's open. We are going to pull the glass off the table at 45-degree angle. And we're pouring gently and slowly because we want a nice balance of beer and foam, but we love foam. So we want to make sure we have foam here. Let's get about 3/4 of the way. We're going to straighten it out and go like this. Pour some beautiful foam. You see, it's perfectly brilliant. All the sediment has been kept in the bottle. If there's beer remaining in the bottle, leave it for the guest, okay? If you go back to refill, never touch the glass again. Once you've filled the first pour, that's it. You don't ever grab the glass again. Now it's the guest's. But if you want to come back around and refill, you do so to the table, being careful not to dislodge any of that sediment. And it stays like this. Once the beer has been poured down and there's only sediment remaining, remove the bottle. And that goes for other bottles too. If you bring a bottle to the table and you dispense the entire bottle, we like to take the bottle away, unless the guest asks for you to leave it there. We just don't want to load up the tables with a bunch of detritus if it's not needed. Some guests are going to want to keep the bottle around to take a look, and that's great, but let's make sure to ask rather than just automatically leaving a bunch of bottles and cans all over the table. So I just mentioned that we never want to pour sediment from the bottle into the glass, and that is 100% true except for a very few styles of beer that are magnificent. The Weissbier family of beers, originally from Bavaria in Germany. So these are beers that we actually do want to pour in a little bit of a different manner, and we want to make sure that we do get all of the sediment out into the beer, both for look, for mouthfeel, and for aroma. We bring the the bottom of the table as always. Showcase it to the guest. Very quietly uncap the bottle. Hide the cap away. And then with Weiss beer, we are going to not only dispense the sediment, it's okay to dip the top of the bottle a little bit as needed. We're going to kind of go in like this. It's very active. Slowly let the beer come out so that we don't overwhelm with foam. Want to get the right amount of foam. Beer. Okay, so now we've got a nice looking beer, but you can see it's still pretty clear. It smells amazing. You can smell it right now. There's some foam and there's some really great yeasty sediment in the bottom of this. So we're going to roll the bottle to pull all that sediment off of the glass. And then see that go in. You can see makes for great theater, but it also is adding a really beautiful haze and even more flavor possibilities to the beer. And now this bottle is empty. Remember that the goal of great service is to remain quiet, to not draw attention to oneself. And so that goes for when you're pouring the beer, but also when you're taking the bottles back to the bar. One of my biggest pet peeves is that so often you hear these clangings of empty bottles and cans being carelessly dropped into recycling bins. So always be sure when it goes back to gently discard of the bottles so that we don't draw too much attention to ourselves. Okay, now we're pouring a larger format bottle for multiple guests. Unlike with a smaller format bottle, we're not going to fill up the entire glass. Whether we're pouring a 750 for 2 guests, 3 guests, 4, 5, 6, we like to pour a good amount of head on a 4-ounce pour and then leave the rest to be filled later on. So we approach as always, showcasing the labels to the guest. Pop the cap quietly. When there's an interior cork, and then we take a 45-degree angle on the glass, as always. And just be mindful to not disturb the sediment and to build some head. So basically half pours here. And then there's beer remaining. No sediment has been displaced. We leave the bottle. Remember, when you go back to refill for your guests, we never touch the glass again. We pick up and we pour direct into the glass. We build some nice head. If you happen to spill like I did, take out your serviette. Just make sure we wipe around a little bit. Clean up. Never wipe the glass once it's been poured into, of course. And that's how you make sure we do a proper pour for a 750. And again, once we get down to nothing but sediment, remove the bottle, let the guests enjoy the rest of the beer in their glass. Okay, now we're going to pour a larger format bottle. One of the coolest traditions for Belgian beer specifically is the larger format bottles, the Magnums, the Jeroboams, the Methuselah. We have some St. Bernardus Ap 12 Magnum Edition 2019 right here. Really fun to pour, lots of pomp and circumstance, and guests absolutely love this. So a lot of the same principles apply here. Of course, you're going to lug it to the table, show it to the guest. Be very careful, especially with these that are so often re-fermented in bottle and under pressure. We want to make sure that we are keeping the cork always away from the guest when we're opening, so that in case anything does happen, nobody loses an eye. That comes off. And again, very slow, no pop. A little bit of a hiss. And then It's really important when we're pouring larger formats to keep one hand on the neck and the other in the punt, or this empty cavern space underneath here. And then to dispense, again, don't want to lose any sediment. Make sure we have a nice amount of head, about 4 ounces each. This is going to be direct into the glass, so you should expect a little bit more head, which is great. And you just know this is an amazing, strong Belgian dark ale filled with so many aromatic compounds from the malt, the fermentation, the hops that they grow at the brewery in West Flanders. And so when you're building this head, I mean, look at that. All of those compounds from the beer are just coming up and getting stuck in the glass. Beautiful. Perfectly clean glassware that's been rinsed and polished means that head retention acts like this. This is exactly what you want to see. And so when you smell this beer, it's incredible. And as the foam subsides, the aromas are even more intense. In the early 2000s, when I got started in craft beer, cans were not really a thing. I mean, Dale's Pale Ale was just coming out, which would revolutionize craft beer in cans. And it's a train that has just not stopped moving. It's something that we've had to adjust to as far as service goes in our bars, tap rooms, and restaurants, because cans are everywhere. Too many people drink directly from the can, and we want to encourage people to drink from glass. So when people order cans at our establishments, obviously if somebody wants to drink from the can, we always say, of course. But if somebody doesn't say anything, we're going to insist on pouring it into a glass. The big thing with the can is I really don't like to pop it tableside. It just feels too dramatic and oftentimes can cause spills, and it can be a little bit loud. It lacks a little of the elegance that I'm looking for from our bottle service. So with cans, we pretend I'm not at the table. We tend to crack them away from the guest, so that when I approach with my tray, always use a tray too. We never walk to tables holding our glass or our beer, should be on a tray. And when I approach, the beer is already open, okay? Which better make sure that you have the right beer, of course, because it can't be brought back. But we like to have it already open so we're not just doing this kind of awkward table side. So we show up like this, and then we pour, same idea, 45-degree angle. Make sure we get the right amount of beer first before we turn and build head. And there we have that done. There's still a little beer in the can, so I'll leave it. Were I to dispense the entire can, I would take it right with me and dispose of it. So now we're going to talk about draft dispense. The first thing about draft dispense is glassware and how clean it is. We always make sure that we have these drip tray glass rinsers at the ready, and they're great. But if your dish machine is in working order, if you have proper water softening and a good charcoal filter that keeps chlorine out, and your glassware is clean and polished, you're not going to need to rinse it before you go to the tap. So I like to kind of inspect glassware, give it a snip from time to time, and not automatically go to the rinser, although it's good to have it there, especially when you're busy and sometimes you're taking glass right out of the dish and it's still pretty hot and you need to get it cold. A rinser's great for that. So this glass is looking good to me. I'm ready to go in. There are certain dispense methods where you should dip the faucet into the beer, and then those where you don't need to. We're really big on texture, so we like to employ lots of different kinds of draft dispense to get different textures on the beer. You see here the side pull. This is a flow control faucet. We don't tend to use standard faucets as much anymore because with the amount of different beers we're pouring from all over the world and different pressures on the interior of the keg, we really need these valves here to let us have control on the restriction of the beer. So when the valve is all the way down, we have full restriction. Very little beer is going to come out, and that's a great way to control a beer that may be overly carbonated and to get it to come out without exploding all over you. That said, a beer that has better carbonation, that's more stable in the keg, you're not going to need to keep it as down as fur. You can go up higher and higher and higher. So the higher you go on the lever, the more beer is going to come through and less restriction. And the lower, the more restriction and less beer that's going to go through. So you can use this to make sure you get the right amount of beer and foam into your glass. But like a standard faucet, the flow control faucet is a very simple on and off switch. So right now it's off, and when I pull it, the beer is going to come. So we have to use the restrictor flow control to control the way that the beer comes out of the tap. 45-degree angle, no dipping on this. So I like to start off with the restrictor in the middle, just in case the keg is coming out a little too foamy, and then I'll angle up if the beer is coming through clear. So don't touch the glass and don't touch the beer. We're going to go 45-degree angle, and we're going to let the beer kind of flow. And if we see some foam coming through, we're going to slow it down. And then we're going to speed it up. We like to have some marks on the glass too to make sure we get the right amount of foam. You see right now we got some good clear beer coming through. We're building our foam. And as we get towards the bottom here, we're going to just pour. There you go. The key thing with this kind of faucet is that we're pouring beer and then we're adding foam on top. Even as American craft beer drinking has become more and more myopic, more and more about American brewed craft beer, there have been some great international influences to finally get here over time. And one of those is the side pull, sometimes erroneously called the slow pour. These are Czech style faucets, perfect for dispensing lager beer. And we've started to install them in our places because, like I mentioned before, we love texture. And this faucet is more than meets the eye. First off, it has a small screen on the interior of the faucet that none of the others here, Flow Controls, has. And that screen causes some buildup of foam within as it comes out. And it provides a kind of wet, dense, cappuccino-like foam to the beer. It's a foam and head that retains much longer than the head you get from a standard faucet, which is great. So when you serve a lager beer, it gets to the guest and it maintains the foam. It maintains that wet, rich, carbonated texture for longer than it would coming off of one of these. So that's the first thing, is that screen in there builds a really cool foam. The other thing is the way that we pour this. So whereas a standard faucet is an on and off switch, a flow control faucet is more of a dimmer. So when we slightly open it, we're going to get a lot of foam. And then when we open it all the way up, we're going to get more beer. Unlike a standard tap where you pour beer and then finish it with foam, with the side pull, we're going to pour foam first and then finish with beer. The other big difference here, and this is like old school dispense, is that we actually dip the faucet. So it's really important that you're removing faucets and cleaning them nightly. So this is a new system. We're going to see how this works here. You can also see that we have a restrictor on the side here to keep the pressure coming from the keg itself. And we're going to pour some great lager beer from our Czech style side pull. Our restrictor is down, so we're not going to bring the beer through too fast. We've got this beautiful screen on the interior that's going to help us build a really special wet cappuccino-like foam on the beer. And when we first open it up, we're going to bring through head, and then we're going to fill the rest with beer, dipping the spout the entire time. So there's a lot that goes into craft beer service that's behind the scenes. Frankly, it doesn't get as much attention as it should. A lot of things that are important about craft beer service are the water that's coming to the bar and to the dish machines, but then the dish machines themselves. So the first thing is this. You want to use a water softener on your water if you happen to have harder water wherever your bar, restaurant, tap room, brew pub may be located. Hard water is going to cause a lot of watermarks on your glasses, so even if you clean them really well, they're going to show up not looking as pristine as they should. So water softeners are key. The other thing is filtration. A lot of municipal water sources have heavy amounts of chlorine, which is great for cleaning the water, but not great for tasting beer, especially because we tend to use some of these glass rinsers. If you don't have clean water coming to your glass rinser, you're taking a sparkly clean glass and then hitting it with chlorine. You're going to smell that chlorine in the glass after you pour. Same thing for the dish machine. So you want to make sure that you filter your water, at least to get the chlorine out. A nice charcoal filter will work for that. The next big thing is the dish machine itself. A lot of bars and restaurants and tap rooms and brew pubs will use 3 chemical machines that are low temp, meaning that the machine itself doesn't get really, really hot, and they're relying on a chlorine-based sanitizer, the 3rd chemical, to really do the cleaning action. We are moving way away from those because, again, we don't feel that the glasses get as clean as they should, and we sometimes get some residual chlorinated sanitizer in there that's no good. So instead, we've moved towards 2 chemicals. So we get rid of that sanitizer, 2 chemical machine, and high temp. This means that we're relying on the high temps of the machines to really do a lot of the cleaning and make sure they're clean. And even better news, if you're using 2 chemical machines already, high temp, is that there's a new line out from Jackson, and this is a high temp machine that also recycles the steam. So one of the knocks on high temp machines in the past has been, yeah, they're great for cleaning and everything else, but when you open up this door, you get plumes of steam that are not exactly what you want around your guests. Well, now Jackson has a machine that recycles that steam and actually is energy efficient to reuse that steam for heating up the next cycle. So now you can clean your glass, not worry about that sanitizer, make sure that it's looking great, and not have huge plumes of steam distracting your bar patrons. Cask beer or real ale was a really huge part of my initial interest in craft beer. The popularity of real ale has certainly waned, not just in this country, but also in England. There's a group of really passionate brewers who continue to turn out incredible firkins of real ale, and publicans who still remain steadfastly interested and passionate about the way that cask beer can be dispensed and the flavors it can showcase. So we love cask beer in the same way that we love side pull lagers or bottle conditioned Belgian style beers. We love different kinds of texture. And when you get real ale on cask, there's no forced carbonation. So all of the CO2 that's coming into the glass comes from the initial or re-fermentation of the beer in the firkin or pin. And so you get this incredible natural carbonation. It's not flat, it's not still, it's mildly effervescent. And the way that malt flavors roll out of a cask and onto your palate is just unparalleled. I truly believe that if you take an English mild or an English bitter and put it on cask, it's going to present in a way that's more complex and more ultimately delicious than if you were to pour it from even a bottle conditioned half liter or from can or from standard keg. So real ale is important. It's the best way to taste particularly low alcohol, malt driven beers or beers that are a little bit more delicately hoppy, particularly those styles that still come to us from the British Isles. As much as I love cask beer, I've learned a ton about it over the years and frankly gotten a lot better at dispensing it. You see here is a classic Engert 2-head cask dispense system, cask engine, which works great, but we've made some improvements. So back in the day, Camera, the campaign for real ale from England, it saved real ale in the 70s and frankly saved real beer in the British Isles in the 70s and 80s, used to insist on truly classic approaches to dispensing cask beer, which meant not using a cask widge, which I'll explain in a second, not using sparklers to build head on your beer, not allowing any CO2 to come at the beer at all, not using a breather, which allows us now to give a kind of carbon dioxide blanket that keeps oxygen out. We went that way for many years and found that we just couldn't keep the beer in the condition that we wanted it for as long as we needed it. So now I'm going to show you what we're doing today, and we believe this is the absolute best way to showcase cask beer stateside at this time. So what you'll see here, we have a cask tapped with a cask widge system. So this cask is already tapped. But the cool thing with this is what we do is we have, when we build our cask setups now, well, let's say if we have 2 dispense engines, we have 1 engine with 2 dispense faucets, we'll build space for 3 casks. Why? Because we never want to tap a cask immediately. So when we get a fresh cask in, that'll go into the 3rd slot not to be tapped quite yet. We leave it there for 24 to 48 hours to settle, so all the sediment can settle to the bottom. Some of the more raucous carbon dioxide that may be in the cask can settle as well. And then we will tap and vent the firkin for a couple of days. What does that mean? Well, it means that we tap the firkin, we put in a soft spile here, but we don't actually attach the hose to serve quite yet. We leave the firkin as it is to breathe naturally. So over the next 24 to 48 hours, the beer is going to change. A little bit of oxidation is going to get in there through this, and it's going to let the beer breathe. It's going to adjust its flavors. It's going to become ready to serve. The CO2 level is going to be perfect. And when it is ready, then we go ahead and tap and dispense. Shortly after we start dispensing the firkin, we're actually going to remove the spile here, because at that point, we do not want to allow any more oxygen in. And then we're going to place the CO2 hose right here instead of the spile. And listen, we are not adding a ton of CO2 to this at all. We keep the pressure at like 5 psi. It's just a gentle blanket to keep oxygen out. And that's going to allow us to pour firkins sometimes up to 10 days or even 2 weeks at optimum flavor, which was unheard of in the past without some of these benches. So the biggest thing that we're using now is the cask widge. And what we love about the cask widge is, first off, the cask can sit upright, which is great, less space behind the bar, but also the system here. The cask widge tube floats in through, you can see it's already in here, but it floats in through the firkin and always sits below the surface level of the beer. So it's always pulling beer from under the surface level. So we're getting less oxygen that way, rather than pulling it from somewhere on top. And so as the beer goes down, it goes down with it. And we always are pulling from underneath. Between this flotation device and pull system and the way that we can both spile and then CO2 blanket, keeps the beer really great and tasting amazing. And the CO2 level is perfect. Sometimes we get really active firkins. So when we'll spile it, we'll get a ton of blow-off foam. We know we've got an active firkin. So when we go to pour those, we use a different kind of sparkler. So what's a sparkler? A sparkler is a little screen that we put on the end of the spout here. Why do we do that? Well, it allows us to agitate the beer and build the right amount of foam in the glass, so it looks great going to the guests and then tastes great going to the guests. Sometimes without a sparkler, particularly as the cask continues to be poured, we don't have quite enough CO2 in there, and so the beer will come out flat. And even if not flat when first poured, pretty flat shortly thereafter getting delivered to the guests. So we don't want that. So we like to use the sparkler today to make sure that we're delivering the beer in its perfect state and maintaining a little bit more of the CO2 as it goes. We're not adding any CO2, we're just agitating. If we have a firkin that's really active and a lot of CO2, we may forego the use of the sparkler, or we may use a sparkler with a larger hole on it. So this is a 1 millimeter sparkler. This is good for active firkins that already have a lot of CO2 buildup. If we have one that's more mild and not gushing with carbonation upon tapping or upon spiling, then we're going to use a 0.6 millimeter sparkler because we want to control that foam. We want to build more agitation, and a smaller hole is going to help us do that. So next I'm going to pour the cask. For these Engert engines, you can get a quarter pull or a half pull, and we always choose the quarter pull, meaning that it's going to take 4 full pulls to fill up the glass. Why? Well, when it takes 4 full pulls, that means that less is coming out each time, but also that less is sitting in the spout or in the engine each time. So that beer in the engine is not going to be as cold, and so the less beer that we can keep in the engine, the better for the beer over time. So we prefer a quarter pull engine that helps us with that. As with a side pull, draft, pour, we are going to dip the sparkler. That's another thing a lot of people think is crazy, but again, we wash the sparklers nightly, and we make sure that we're always rinsing and washing our spouts as well. So when we go to pour, we get right up in. That's also why it has this beautiful gooseneck, so we can get right up in there like this. We start pouring. So there's the first quarter. And there you have it. Guinness, back in the 1950s, started to create a different kind of draft system to kind of showcase cask-type pour, but with a longer shelf life for their kegs. That's the nitro pour. I don't have a nitro pour set up here today, but a nitro pour is similar to cask in that it should yield this kind of creamy, beautifully tight, bubbled effervescence. But unlike a cask, you don't dip a nitro pour. But like a cask, you actually pour about a third at a time. And so you'll pour some, let it cascade. Pour some, let it cascade. Pour some, let it cascade, and then you'll have your full pour. A nitro is different though because it's far creamier, and I still love a nitro pour because I think it delivers textures you can't get from a cask engine, from a side pull, from a bottle conditioned beer, or from a standard faucet. So we're here at Shelter, our newest beer bar that actually hasn't even opened yet. That's why it's so squeaky clean. And I wanted to show you a few things about the walk-in cooler that's so important. First of all, as with everything, whether it's glassware, under bar storage, cleanliness is everything. So making sure you're keeping your draft system clean on the exterior in here is really important. Almost as important as keeping your lines clean. So what we have in here is a 50 tap system, but we're really big on temperature controls. So the cooler itself is kept at 37 degrees, which is a great temp for storage and a horrible temp for tasting. So if we were to keep it 37 and run it out to the bar at this temp, it would be too cold, it would inhibit aromas, it wouldn't work. And of course, we're pouring beers of every make and model, different bodies, textures, flavors, aromas. So we need versatility. We need the ability to pour any of them at colder temps, medium temps, higher temps. The pilsners and lagers that we serve out of here have to come out at 42 degrees. That's the ideal temp. The IPAs, the porters, those need to come out at 48 degrees. The imperial stouts and the barley wines need to come out at 54 degrees. So how do we do that? Well, first off, on the roof, which you can't see, that's where we put our power packs. A power pack regulates the flow and temperature of glycol, the refrigerant that maintains the temp of the beer from the draft system and the cold box to the faucets, right? So what we do is we get multiple power packs, each set to a different temp, to make sure that once the beer leaves here, it stays at either 42, 48, or 54 degrees. That said, we still need to get the beer from 37 to those temps. And the way that we do that are through these reverse heat exchangers right here. So actually, this is the reverse heat exchanger that handles lines 1 through 10, which in our systems are always the 42 degree beers. So those taps are over there. That's where the couplers are. They run up and over, and then they hit in here. And so what this is, if you know like a jockey box has coils, that's basically what this is, except the coil, there's many, many coils. There's lots of line in here. And so when it comes in at 37, we're washing those coils with glycol refrigerant from upstairs to change the temp from 37 to 42 degrees. We're warming the beer in this box, and then you can see when it leaves the box, it's insulated. So it's coming in at 37, getting warm to 42, and leaving insulated to go out to our taps. Obviously, that's only 10 of our 50 lines. So the other 30 lines that are next go into these 3 boxes, 10 products each. They're going in at 37, coming out in those insulated lines, trunk lines, at 48, and going out to the taps. Last but not least, we have 10 lines over here. Those are sitting at 37 like everything else, and they're coming up into this reverse heat exchanger and turning to 54 degrees, and then they're coming out through the ceiling and being dispensed that way. So that's how we maintain and dispense all our beers at the proper temp. The other big thing with this is that these heat exchangers are a huge advantage now. In the old days, when we first opened Church Key back in 2009, which is crazy, we didn't have this technology and we weren't using it. So what we did there to have the temps right is we just built separate walk-ins and had separate power packs that kept it. So the beer would be held at 42 and transported at 42 and dispensed at 42, same for 48 in a different cooler, 54 in a different cooler. But the problem with that is when you store beer at warm temps, you do get CO2 breakout. And so were we to hold everything in here at warmer temps, the carbonation gets lost, especially at those that are going out at 54 degrees. By holding it all at 37, we keep it all the CO2 locked in as the brewer intended, which is huge. The other thing about 42, 48, or 54 degree coolers is that mold forms. Not a big deal, not going to kill anybody, but it just makes you have to clean incessantly because of those types of mold forms. So in here at 37, we still clean a lot, but we don't have to worry about mold, we don't have to worry about CO2 breakout, and we can still achieve the temperature changes we need for maximum tasting experiences at the bar through these heat exchangers, and then the glycol loop that comes in from up top. When you're looking at this system, there's been a few other really cool evolutions over time. The first thing is we try to use stainless steel whenever possible, right? So because that cleans the best. The other thing is that the tubing we're using for our draft lines now is wine grade tubing. We get it from Micromatic. When I say wine grade, it means that it's so durable that it can withstand high acidity wines and of course high acidity beer. So having wine grade tubing on your draft lines, stainless steel components wherever you can. We love to have individual regulators on each of our beers because our beers are all over the map when it comes to internal CO2 pressures. So a high pressure beer needs to have the pressure turned up to dispense properly. If everything was tied to one regulator, we wouldn't be able to specifically adjust regulations to make sure the beer was coming out properly. So 50 regulators make sure that we can tinker with each line and make sure that beers are coming out at the proper regulated pressure. Very, very key. One last thing I wanted to tell everybody about is the jumper line. So the jumper line is the line that comes to us from the fob, the foam on beer. This is the contraption that allows us to bleed air off of the beer from the keg before it goes out to the dispense tower. By this way, we can bleed off the air without losing beer, and that makes it so that the beer doesn't come out a foamy mess on the other end. The other thing is, once we kick the keg, we can bypass this to make sure we get all of the beer out of the line. That's very important for systems that aren't direct draw. We can't afford to leave all the beer in the line. The other huge new thing that we're doing is, in the old days, jumper lines, that which went from the fob to the coupler and the keg, were often just vinyl. And vinyl doesn't really clean that well at all. And you'll see this is actually vinyl for our gas tubing, that's fine. It's just the CO2 and nitrogen blend, that's okay. But using vinyl on your jumper is tough because it gets dirty over time. So you either, if you're using vinyl, have to replace it all the time nonstop, or you've got a problem. Why do we use vinyl? Well, because vinyl is a type of tubing that's very malleable. And even though this is nice and clean right now, when we get 70 kegs in here, we have to have the flexibility to move things all over the place and to move kegs around. And so you need, your jumper tubing has to be flexible. Well, we can't use wine grade tubing that we're using for the draft lines because it's simply not malleable. It's really rigid. So we searched and searched and searched and found a really great product for Eldon James. It's called silver tubing, and that's what this is. It's really durable, it cleans really well, it's very malleable, and it is the best option for vinyl. Micromatic also has a really nice tubing that they're using as well now, but we really love the Eldon James silver, and it makes it so that we can have the ability to move our kegs around, but still have really, really clean beer from coupler to the fob, and then all the way out to the draft tower. Building experiences for our guests has been our primary concern from day one. It's why we've built all of our bars, why we've invested in these really incredible draft systems, in the right dish machines, in the right glassware, in training the right staff so that we can tell stories about beers, make sure they taste exactly as the brewer intended, and pair our beers with incredible foods. We want to consistently create memorable experiences and give guests a reason to come back and drink with us. We know now that you can get craft beer anywhere. You can drink it at your house, but why would you come to Shelter where we are, or Church Key, or the Sovereign, or Grand Delancey in New York City? What can we do there that you're not going to get from your home drinking experience, or maybe the drinking experience you'd have at another bar or restaurant and tap room? It all starts with daily passion, making sure that everything is just right, caring about each drop of beer that's dispensed from your draft system, from your cask engine, from your bottle collection. If we do all this, we know that guests are going to not just love the beers they're drinking, but love the places in which they drink. And that's always going to be important for those of us who love bars and restaurants and tap rooms and brew pubs and production breweries, and anywhere you can drink the best beers in the world. Thanks for watching, and if you're ever in the DC area, join us at Shelter or at Church Key, Birch and Barley, The Sovereign, Blue Jacket, our brewery down in Navy Yard by National Stadium. If you're in Northern Virginia, check out Rustico. We have 2 locations. One is in Alexandria, the other in the Ballston neighborhood of Arlington. If you find yourself in North Bethesda or Montgomery County generally in Maryland, definitely head over to Owen's Ordinary. If you're in New York City, check out the Grand Delancey on the Lower East Side. We'd love to have you.